G'day guys, welcome back. Today we're going to break away from our cues and our context on our core lifts, and we're going to look at something a little bit different, taking a sports science route, and we're looking at the principle of training analysis, picking a context of a specific sport, and then going through some bits and pieces around testing and what prescription we'll take. So today we're going to work with the principle of a training analysis, and this really should underpin most of what we do as strength and conditioning coaches, and that is we take an athlete and we understand his or her physical limitations in their chosen sport. Once we can do that needs analysis and figure out what those limitations are, we can go on to test them, and that will give us a scope of where the athlete sits in a range of normal values, or also give us a baseline for that athlete prior to prescription. And then hopefully what we can do is prescribe to enhance those physiological facets that we deem limitations. From there, we want to see a performance enhancement, and that will be through competition for that given athlete. Now today, I'm looking at endurance running, and in particular, longer events like a marathon or a city to surf and that sort of thing. And my goal is effectively to run faster. So I'm taking myself as the athlete. I was lucky enough to go through some different testing protocols last week, which we'll go through, and they've given me some data, and then we can make some calls on that. So if I'm looking at endurance running, there are three big physiological limitations that we define based on the key literature that we know, and that is your VO2 max, your lactate threshold, and your running economy. These three will make up effectively how fast I can run in the race, and then therefore these three variables are critical to test, understand, and prescribe. So the first thing we look at is my VO2 max. VO2 max is essentially your capacity to do work. So when I breathe in and I'm fueling my muscles during a race, I'm giving them oxygen. It's the maximum amount that I can transfer to my muscles to get them going and continue doing whatever aerobic work that I'm doing. In this case, they were testing my work output on a treadmill with an incremental incline, and basically I had to increase power and power up and up and up as the incline went up, and as a result I matched that by increasing my VO2 to a maximum value. So what we'll see characteristically, it's a linear shaped curve up until we get a plateau, and that plateau will define my max. I read back off the graph and I get 53 mils per kilogram per minute. Putting that in context, we know that that is a fairly decent score for a well-trained amateur athlete. Anything above 65, we're getting into an elite zone, and anything above 70, we're getting into highly trained triathletes and Olympic level running athletes. The second factor is lactate threshold. This can be assessed in the same test as our VO2 max by taking blood samples. And we know that our definition of our lactate threshold is essentially the maximum VO2 that I can sustain for an endurance event. And that maximum VO2 translates into a running speed effectively. And so past that point, if I run any faster for that event, I'll lactate out, I'll dump a whole lot of lactate into my blood, and I'll get an exponential increase, and I won't be able to aerobic capacity. So from a blood lactate point of view, our does a similar thing in terms of it's at a baseline, it's at a steady value of about 2 to 4 millimoles in the blood, and then past a specific VO2 max, I get an exponential increase where it just essentially falls off a cliff and I get a dump of lactate into my blood. For me, this value was 43 mils of my VO2, and as a percentage, I can then take that value, divide it by my maximum value, and I get 80% for my lactate threshold. Putting that in context, anybody with 75+% is a very well-trained athlete. In this category, I've done pretty well, and that's a very good value. The last thing we look at is running economy. Running economy is essentially exactly what it sounds like. It's how efficiently I can move my body over a kilometer. And that is defined as the cost of oxygen, aka energy, per kilogram per kilometer. This is done with a different test with some steady state values, running at different speeds and looking at heart rates and seeing what values I can hold. And that spat out the number of 244 mils per kilo per kilometer. And that puts me in a pretty average category. The poor end of the average scale sits at like 230 to 250 mils. And that kind of explains my context pretty well. I'm a power athlete, I'm a rugby union athlete, I'm carrying a lot of weight that I don't need to if I'm a runner, and I'm equipped to do different tasks. An elite context would be anything below 200 mils is an exceptionally good economy as an athlete. This leads us to this equation that we come up with, which is essentially our speed is equal to our VO2 max times our lactate threshold, all divided by our running economy. Now, that is effectively saying the maximum speed I can run at aerobically without going off a cliff in my lactate, divided by how efficient I am, running economy, at running. And that spits out this number for me, which is about, excuse me, 0.1776 kilometers per minute. Now, to put that in context, that looks like a 3-hour 40 marathon or a 70 odd minute city to surf. So I'm right in that average category in terms of endurance running, but again, it kind of describes how accurate these tests are when we know that my context is completely different and I'm not in fact an endurance athlete. So based on these, if we wanted to make me run faster, we then go back to our limitations that we've tested and identify where I am. So firstly, VO2 max, I've got a bit of scope for improvement there. 53 mils is not in the elite category, and I've got a bit of capacity to get up to that 65 plus value. So that's definitely an area I'd focus on in terms of increasing my aerobic capacity. My lactate threshold sits in a pretty high category already, so we're going to brush that category in terms of a training intervention. Remember, we want to give our athletes as much bang for their buck as possible, and we're also working with a limited time frame. So we're going to focus on aerobic capacity. Lastly, looking at my running economy, I'm sitting in a pretty average category as well. So off that, on our prescription analysis, we know that we need to focus on two key things. My VO2 increasing, my aerobic capacity, and my running economy decreasing, so getting more efficient.